Welcome to Warming Tales Frias. Today's story reveals how courage and determination can shift the tides of injustice. When a flight attendant harassed a black woman during her flight, no one expected her to be the key negotiator for the airline's most lucrative contract. What happened next? Watch and witness how 6 minutes of courage reshaped corporate culture. If this story moves you, don't forget to like, comment, and hit subscribe for more tales of inspiration and resilience.
She adjusted her carry-on bag, trying her best not to draw attention, though a small part of her realized the eyes fixed on her were not simply casual glances. She was used to stares, used to defying expectations, but something about this morning felt different. She wore a tailored burgundy pantsuit that set her apart from the crowd lined up at the gate. Her stride possessed a steady confidence, suggesting she was a woman on a mission, but she kept her expression neutral. On a normal business trip, she blended in just enough to do her work without fuss. Today, however, the tension in the air was undeniable. It was the subtle hostility that often flickered in the periphery of her life, the kind of prejudice that slid in sideways without an introduction. She noticed how certain employees at the gate cast sidelong glances, as if looking for a reason to question her. Yet she said nothing. She had business to handle, and she intended to do it smoothly. Her phone vibrated, a reminder of her schedule. She was supposed to meet her team once she landed, double-check final details for a partnership contract that could reshape the airline's future. She did not flaunt that piece of information. She figured it was always best to remain discreet about her role. People liked to make assumptions, especially when they saw her skin color first and credentials second. She forced herself to remain calm, ignoring the hushed whispers and raised eyebrows. If anything, she felt a growing determination to prove her worth. The moment she stepped onto the plane, she could sense the hostility intensify. A flight attendant stood at the entrance, greeting passengers, but her smile froze the moment she locked eyes with the elegant traveler in burgundy. "Ticket, please," came the stiff request. The traveler handed over her boarding pass, noticing how the attendant's expression tightened just enough to signal trouble. "Are you sure you're in the right boarding group?" The attendant's tone dripped with suspicion, a subtle hostility that flicked like a needle. The traveler pressed her lips into a thin line. She inhaled, aware that every breath had to be steady, measured, if she wanted to get through this moment without conflict. The traveler pointed to the boarding pass in the attendant's hand, wordlessly affirming the group assignment printed on it. "All right, ma'am," the flight attendant said, passing the boarding pass back. The traveler entered the aircraft, heading for her seat in the business class section. She tried to ignore the stares from nearby passengers, some already turned in their seats to watch. Her seat was near the window, and she slipped in, placing her carry-on beneath the seat in front. She had plans to respond to a few urgent messages before takeoff. Instead, she found her thoughts drifting, focusing on the sense that this flight would be anything but routine. She gazed out the window, losing herself in the expanse of runway and distant planes. It was a gray morning, the sky heavy with unspoken tension. She felt it as if it was pushing down on her from all angles. Then a gentle voice broke her reverie. A child across the aisle asked his mother about her, pointing innocently, unaware of the mother's flustered attempt to shush him. The traveler gave the child a small wave. The child waved back. She smiled inwardly, reminded that not everyone looked at her with negative intent. Yet the memory of the attendant's accusatory question lingered. Little slights like that could spark something deeper if not addressed, but she knew better than to let a single moment of rudeness shape her entire perspective. She reminded herself that she had important matters to handle. This trip was about business, not personal drama. She felt her phone buzzing in her pocket, certain it was another update about the negotiation. The contract in question promised to bring new routes and fresh investment. The airline executives, enthralled by the massive opportunity, had flown her out first class on previous occasions. She had once hoped that this particular airline might be a bastion of equality, one that didn't judge a person based on color, but her experiences were beginning to paint a less rosy picture. She knew how to compartmentalize, though. She would finalize the contract and address any unfortunate events later. When the plane began filling up, an older man in a suit approached her seat, verifying his seat assignment before settling in. He gave her a polite nod, though he couldn't hide his slight surprise at sharing this section with her. She wondered how often he traveled, how many people of color he encountered in business class. Still, they exchanged pleasantries and she tried to focus on her phone. Another message popped up, reminding her of a quick teleconference scheduled shortly after landing. She began mentally mapping her day, ignoring the flight attendant now moving through the aisle, greeting certain passengers warmly while offering strained courtesy to others. The flight attendant's voice carried a practiced edge, giving safety reminders and routine instructions. There were moments of normalcy, enough that the traveler thought perhaps the earlier tension would subside. She slipped on headphones, hoping to lose herself in a work presentation. Moments later, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She paused her audio, raising her gaze to find the same flight attendant looking down, arms folded. "Excuse me, ma'am," the attendant said. "We have some concerns about the location of your carry-on bag. May I see your boarding pass again?" The traveler tried to stay calm. She retrieved her boarding pass and handed it over. The attendant scrutinized it, then glanced at the overhead bins. "It seems you're in business class, but your carry-on is stowed in a space designated for first-class passengers. We'll need to move it." The traveler was momentarily confused. She hadn't placed her bag in the overhead bin. It was beneath the seat. She explained that it was under her seat, which was well within her right to store personal items. The attendant blinked, eyes flicking to the space under the traveler's seat. Indeed, the bag was there, not bothering anyone. The attendant's expression soured, but she forced a thin-lipped smile. "All right, I see. Just remember to keep it properly tucked in. We want to maintain a safe environment for everyone." The traveler nodded, but she could feel her pulse quicken. Something about the flight attendant's demeanor felt targeted, not just an innocent check. She offered a quiet acknowledgement and went back to her presentation. She had encountered such microaggressions before, and she knew letting them rattle her might lead to an avoidable confrontation. Time seemed to drag as more passengers boarded. Then a younger flight attendant began distributing bottled water and small comfort items to business class. When she reached the traveler's row, she smiled and handed over the items without incident. The traveler breathed a silent sigh of relief, hoping this more cordial attendant might balance out the negativity from the other. But as she stretched in her seat, she noticed the older flight attendant glaring from a distance, a stern look that sparked renewed concern. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing a slight delay. The plane would be on the runway for a few extra minutes as a mechanical check was completed. Restless movements rippled through the cabin, overhead lights occasionally flickering. The traveler watched the older flight attendant weaving between seats, appearing to speak only to passengers who looked like they were used to being catered to. A twinge of resentment bubbled in her chest, but she kept quiet. She found the airline's polite veneer slipping. Still, she told herself to focus on the big picture, the contract. Just as she tried to resume her reading, she heard a muffled dispute near the front of the cabin. A black couple was being asked about an upgrade. From what she overheard, they had used frequent flyer miles for business class seats, and the flight attendant appeared skeptical of their status. The woman's face was drawn tight as she explained that they had every right to be there. She had a corporate job, she traveled often, and her husband was a part of a consultancy firm. The flight attendant cut them off, claiming they might have to be reseated. It felt like a pattern. The traveler couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that this was not an isolated mistake, but a broader discriminatory attitude. She felt compelled to step in, but she weighed her options. She was on the brink of finalizing a major agreement, and she didn't want to risk a scene that might overshadow her professional objectives. Yet, every second that passed, the tension thickened. Ultimately, another attendant intervened, politely guiding the couple to remain in their seats. The older flight attendant, with a tight-lipped frown, walked away, evidently displeased. Finally, the plane began to move, taxiing toward the runway. The traveler closed her eyes, exhaling. She needed to keep her composure. This was a short flight, less than 3 hours, and she would handle the contract negotiations afterward. She told herself she could deal with the airline's biases once her official duties were done. She often found that the most effective approach was to maintain her calm exterior until the opportune moment. She had learned long ago that her greatest power often lay in letting assumptions pile up before revealing her true position. The engine's hum roared, and within minutes they were airborne. People busied themselves with drinks, overhead lights switching on as flight attendants prepared to serve. The older flight attendant lingered near the traveler again, making pointed small talk with the man in the next seat while ignoring her presence. After a moment, the attendant turned abruptly. "Ma'am, can I get you anything?" The traveler asked for water and a napkin. The attendant gave a curt nod and stalked off, returning with a half-smile that didn't reach her eyes. She placed the items down without care, causing water droplets to spill. The traveler bit back a response. She recognized the attendant's behavior as provocative. Sighing, she dabbed at the spilled water and tried to distract herself with her phone. A beep signaled that Wi-Fi was available. She opened her email. The contract's legal team had sent her the final documents, and she needed to review them before the official signing. She scrolled through the attachments, her eyes scanning for any red flags. Meanwhile, she noticed new activity in the aisle. The older flight attendant was leaning over a young black man, asking him question after question about his seat. The traveler's heart sank as she overheard bits of the exchange. It was the same pattern: doubt, suspicion, the insinuation that maybe he wasn't supposed to be there. A swirl of emotions churned inside her. This was beyond mere rudeness. She glanced at her phone, realizing she had the power to tip the scales. But was this the right moment? The man politely explained he was traveling on a company ticket, that he had boarded correctly. The attendant's eyes narrowed as though searching for a reason to challenge him. When he produced the documentation, she gave a tight nod and moved on. The traveler felt her throat tighten. She checked the time. Only 20 minutes into the flight, and she had lost count of how many times the attendant had singled out black passengers. She recalled the corporation that had sent her the contract. They believed this airline was progressive. They had bragged about its diversity initiatives. She wondered what they would say if they saw what she was seeing now. She forced herself to scan the contract once more, finding a paragraph about ethical partnership guidelines. The irony stung. The airline touted ethical standards, yet their staff's behavior contradicted the glossy image they sold to the public. She thought of the immense sum of money tied up in this partnership. She thought of the airline's executives who had made promises about improvement, about inclusion. She remembered how they had wooed her, confident her endorsement would bolster their brand. She refused to let anger control her. She had a responsibility to her own integrity and to the people who would be impacted by such a deal. She made a silent vow to keep observing, collecting the evidence in her mind. If something else happened, she would not simply let it pass. She typed a quick note into her phone, bullet points capturing the discriminatory exchanges she'd witnessed so far. The flight progressed, the cabin lights dimming for a short while as the attendants prepared to serve snacks. The younger flight attendant brought the traveler a snack tray, along with a genuine smile, asking if she needed anything else. The traveler thanked her and tried to relax, though her stomach felt knotted. She realized not every crew member shared the same prejudice, but the older flight attendant's behavior overshadowed the kindness of the younger staff. The older attendant reappeared, her gaze flickering toward the traveler's phone, as if checking to see if she was filming. The traveler wasn't, but she wondered what might happen if she were. She considered that action briefly, then decided she would handle it differently. She wanted to remain discreet and poised, remembering the contract that needed final review. She forced a small smile, meeting the attendant's eyes directly. The attendant looked away quickly, pretending to be focused on another passenger. A loud voice from the galley caught the traveler's attention. A commotion was forming around a black woman who was trying to ask for help. She seemed distressed, explaining something about an unexpected fee on her seat assignment. The older flight attendant was at the center of it. Her voice raised, insisting the woman needed to produce certain documents or face an additional charge. The passenger was clearly upset, trying to figure out what the attendant was talking about. Several heads turned, and the traveler could feel the tension building. She couldn't stay silent anymore. She unbuckled her seatbelt and approached the galley calmly. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Is everything all right here?" The black woman turned, relief washing over her features as if grateful for an ally. The flight attendant scowled. "Everything's fine, ma'am. Please return to your seat." "I'd like to make sure she's being helped properly," the traveler replied. The older attendant squared her shoulders, obviously not expecting to be challenged. She insisted the passenger hadn't provided the correct documentation and might be penalized. The traveler looked at the passenger, who fished out her phone, showing a confirmation email that stated she had paid for her seat weeks ago. There was no mention of extra fees. The traveler glanced between the email and the attendant, noticing how the attendant's expression faltered. Finally, the attendant murmured something about technical issues, then stormed off to consult with someone else. The traveler gave the woman a supportive nod, directing her to remain calm and keep her email open as proof. She then returned to her seat, her mind buzzing. Emails and updates continued to flood the traveler's phone. She thumbed through them mechanically, her gaze drifting back to the older attendant patrolling the aisle like a silent guard. In just one flight, the attendant had harassed multiple black passengers, each time inventing some borderline credible reason to question their legitimacy. The traveler's resolve hardened. She was done playing nice. After everything she had witnessed, she felt a moral obligation to act. She scrolled to a name in her contacts, the airline's regional director of corporate relations. She opened a blank email, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She composed a succinct but pointed summary of the flight attendant's behavior, making it clear how many incidents had occurred. Then she attached the airline's own stated commitments to diversity and fairness. She concluded with a warning that she expected immediate action. She saved the draft without sending it. She wanted to see if anything else would happen before they landed. The rest of the flight continued in a tense hush. She could see the older flight attendant shooting dagger-like glances whenever she passed a black passenger. She spoke politely with others, inquiring about their comfort, but offered no courtesy to those she seemingly distrusted. The traveler's mind raced with memories of her own professional journey, the obstacles she faced, the slights and overt racism she endured. She had grown adept at maintaining composure, but this was different. She had power now, real power to influence the airline's fate. Eventually, the pilot announced they were beginning their descent. The traveler kept her phone on, ready to utilize the brief window of Wi-Fi if needed. She sensed something would push the attendant too far. Sure enough, just as they were preparing for landing, the attendant returned to the traveler's row, eyes scanning for a minor infraction. She noticed the traveler's phone still on, ignoring the fact that many passengers also had devices running. "Ma'am, I need you to power down your device." The traveler complied, turning off the Wi-Fi, but not before pressing send on the email draft addressed to corporate. The attendant's timing was unwittingly perfect. The message was out. She took a steady breath and put her phone in airplane mode. The older attendant hovered, as if trying to confirm that the device was indeed off, but she didn't say anything further. The traveler offered her a polite smile that revealed nothing of the email just sent. They landed smoothly, but tensions remained high. As soon as the plane reached the gate, people started gathering their belongings. The traveler knew she would likely receive a reply from the airline's regional director the moment she turned her phone off airplane mode. She retrieved her carry-on, which was stowed exactly as it should have been. The older attendant was in the aisle, scanning the seats to ensure no one left items behind. The traveler stepped out into the aisle. The attendant looked her up and down. The traveler, with quiet composure, thanked the attendant for the flight. She disembarked, heart pounding. It wasn't fear or anger that propelled her, but an urgent sense of responsibility. Something told her that the next steps would echo far beyond this flight. She made her way through the jet bridge, phone in hand, waiting for the cellular signal. The moment the bars appeared, an email notification pinged. She opened it discreetly while joining the throng of passengers moving into the terminal. It was from the airline's regional director, marked urgent. The response contained a flurry of apologies and a promise to investigate immediately. The traveler read it, feeling a pulse of vindication. But the morning was far from over. She headed toward a quiet seating area near the connecting gates. Her schedule was tight, but she needed to address this before leaving the airport. She shot a quick text to her corporate team. "We may need to reevaluate the contract. We'll discuss soon." Then she dialed the airline's regional director, stepping out of the flow of foot traffic so she could speak privately. The phone rang only once before a breathless voice answered. The director assured her that the airline took such matters seriously. The traveler described the incidents in detail, citing passenger after passenger who had been singled out. The director was mortified and requested that she keep this matter confidential while they launched an internal inquiry. The traveler hesitated, recalling how the airline had promised so many changes before. She insisted on more immediate accountability. She ended the call feeling only partially reassured. She realized how often corporations paid lip service to these issues but took minimal action unless something threatened their profits. The traveler had the power to threaten those profits, and she intended to use it wisely. She still had to attend a crucial meeting that would finalize the largest contract the airline had ever seen. She was the key negotiator, the intermediary between her company and the airline. With a single signature, she could confirm or deny the arrangement. She considered her next step carefully. She located the car service reserved for her and slid into the back seat, instructing the driver to take her to the headquarters of the firm she represented. As they pulled away from the airport, she stared at the city skyline in the distance, thinking about the potential ramifications. She had dedicated months to hammering out this deal, but she also believed strongly in ethical partnerships. Memories of the flight lingered, each confrontation a reminder that prejudice was alive and well. Her phone rang again. It was her immediate supervisor, an executive who had championed the partnership. She answered, hearing the tension in his voice as he asked about her flight. Evidently, the regional director had contacted him, expressing concern about how the traveler might respond to the blatant discrimination she'd witnessed. The executive wanted her to hold off on any drastic measures until they could talk in person. She listened, not committing to anything. She felt a pang of frustration. Why should she protect the airline's interests when they had shown such disregard for their passengers? She arrived at the sleek downtown building, stepping out of the car into a whirl of city sounds. The security guards recognized her, waving her through the lobby. She took the elevator to the top floor, where glass walls revealed a panoramic view of the skyline. She had to gather her thoughts for the negotiations. In the corridor, she passed a colleague who asked how her trip was. She responded tersely, "We'll talk inside." The colleague looked puzzled, but didn't press. Inside the executive conference room, a long table awaited. Several people were already there, including 2 from the airline looking confident. They stood up when she entered, offering polite greetings, but she noticed how one of them flinched slightly upon seeing her expression. She maintained a firm posture, offering a curt handshake. The conversation began with pleasantries, the airline representatives praising the potential synergy of their partnership, the massive projected profits. She let them speak without interrupting, just nodding at the appropriate moments. When it came time for her to address the room, she took a measured breath and laid out the documentation. She spoke about the contract's finer points, verifying certain clauses and the timelines. The airline reps smiled, seeing no immediate sign of trouble. They must have assumed that her presence meant all was proceeding as planned. She glanced at her supervisor, noting how anxious he looked. He must have suspected she would do something bold. After finishing the formalities, she paused. She locked eyes with one of the airline reps, a man in a tailored suit. "I had an interesting flight this morning," she said quietly. His face twitched, and she detected a flicker of concern. "I witnessed multiple incidents of racial harassment by one of your flight attendants. Not just against me, but against other black passengers as well. I have documented each incident, including passenger statements." A hush fell over the room. The airline reps exchanged glances, their polished exteriors cracking under the weight of her words. Her supervisor opened his mouth as if to intervene, but she continued. "Your airline has promoted itself as a champion of diversity. This contract we're about to finalize includes ethical guidelines that your company claims to uphold. Based on what I experienced, it seems those claims may not be entirely accurate." One rep looked ready to protest, but the other placed a hand on his arm, urging him to remain calm. She let the silence expand, a deliberate tactic to let them feel the gravity of the situation. Then she spoke again, her voice steady. "I am in a position to recommend whether we sign or cancel this contract. Given the seriousness of what happened, I need to see immediate, concrete steps to address this. Otherwise, I will advise my organization to terminate negotiations. I believe you know how significant this contract is for your airline's future." She noticed the startled expressions across the table. One airline rep struggled to maintain composure. He explained that they had just learned of the incident, that it was an isolated case. He assured her the flight attendant would be disciplined and that they were appalled by the behavior. "Please, let's resolve this amicably," he implored. "We can't let the actions of one employee undermine everything we've built together." She was unmoved by the plea for leniency. She recalled the pain in the faces of the passengers who had been targeted. She recalled the flight attendants' repeated hostility. "It wasn't just one incident," she explained calmly. "It was multiple incidents against multiple people who look like me. That suggests a deeper issue. I need you to understand that it's not enough to discipline one employee. If your corporate culture tolerates such behavior, your PR statements and trainings are meaningless." Her supervisor was tense. He tried to guide the conversation to possible remediation plans. The airline reps scrambled to propose solutions. Mandatory training, a review of hiring processes, even a direct apology to the individuals affected. The traveler listened, but held firm. She had heard such promises before. The difference was that now she had the upper hand, and they knew it. Time felt slow as the conversation stretched, negotiations turning from enthusiastic to desperate. She asked pointed questions about how they planned to improve accountability. She insisted that if she didn't see immediate measures, she would walk away. The airline reps began to understand that this was not a bluff. They pleaded for a chance to remedy the situation. She consulted briefly with her supervisor, stepping out of the room for privacy. He seemed torn between the lucrative deal and the ethical stand she was taking. She explained that she couldn't in good conscience sign off if the airline didn't show real commitment to change. Her supervisor realized she was immovable on this point. Ultimately, he conceded that she had the final say. Returning to the conference room, she found the airline reps clutching documents anxiously. One of them began rattling off new proposals, including an immediate rollout of stricter policies, an investigation into the flight's cabin crew, and personal assurances that they would monitor all staff more closely. She let them speak, glancing occasionally at her supervisor. Finally, she raised a hand, silencing the flurry of words. She gave a cool nod. "If these measures are implemented swiftly and effectively, I might consider it. But I'm warning you, any future complaint, no matter how small, could jeopardize this partnership. I will be watching." A collective exhale seemed to fill the room. The airline reps expressed their gratitude, promising unwavering dedication to upholding the newly proposed standards. The traveler remained stoic, aware that only time would tell if they would keep their word. She rechecked the final contract, ensuring new clauses addressing accountability were inserted. She insisted on a clause that allowed her company to withdraw at any moment if evidence of discriminatory practices persisted. The airline reps nodded, though their faces revealed a mixture of relief and dread. Their biggest contract now hinged on their ability to keep their promise. With those amendments made, she signed. The airline reps followed, pen strokes shaky. Her supervisor added his signature. The documents were sealed. The airline's future soared or plummeted depending on whether they truly reformed. She gathered her belongings and left the room without another word. Outside, she allowed herself a moment to exhale. The adrenaline still coursed through her veins. She had used her influence to demand accountability. She thought of the flight attendant, of the black passengers who had been humiliated. She thought of how that woman had singled her out the moment she boarded, as if she didn't belong. Now, just a few hours later, the airline was in crisis mode to retain her company's partnership. She felt both the weight and the power of what had happened. Word spread quickly through the corridors that negotiations had almost collapsed. As she returned to the lobby, a few colleagues nodded supportively. She got into the waiting car, instructing the driver to take her to the hotel where she had arranged to stay. She stared at her phone, noticing new emails from the airline's higher-ups, each one groveling. She set her phone aside, letting them wait. At the hotel, she checked in with minimal conversation, her mind replaying the day's events. She had never intended to use her position to exact vengeance. She simply wanted fairness. But in a world where so many turned a blind eye, she had found herself in a position to correct an injustice, or at least shine a spotlight on it. She dropped her suitcase by the bed and sank into a chair, the city lights dancing across the windows. Her phone buzzed again with messages, some from grateful passengers who had overheard that she stood up for them, others from airline executives offering new gestures of goodwill. She opened a message from the black woman who had been charged an extra fee. The woman thanked her for intervening, explaining that the difference in how she was treated felt humiliating until she realized someone noticed and cared enough to speak up. The traveler felt a surge of conviction. Moments like that reinforced the importance of using influence to protect those without power. The next day, she received a phone call from one of the airline's top executives, a man she had spoken to only once before. He poured out apologies, pledging to spearhead a rapid review of employee conduct. She listened calmly, making it clear that words were cheap. She would need to see meaningful transformation. He promised updates every month. She agreed to wait, but she was determined that if the changes did not materialize, the contract would be terminated. Over the following weeks, the airline publicly announced new policies, mandatory bias training for all staff, and a zero-tolerance approach to discrimination. Some critics called it lip service, but the traveler watched carefully to see if their actions matched their promises. She heard that the older flight attendant had been suspended, pending a full investigation. Meanwhile, internal emails circulated, reminding employees that the airline's largest partnership hinged on ethical conduct. She could practically see the tension behind the scenes as they rushed to prove they were serious. Through it all, she carried a sense of resolve. She recalled the disbelieving look on the flight attendant's face when she quietly defied her. She remembered the sorrow and anger in the other passengers' eyes. She recognized that her stance had not only served her own dignity but also might pave a safer path for others. Despite the draining process, she felt proud that she had stayed true to her convictions. She attended a few more meetings with airline representatives, each time making sure to include discussions about diversity and inclusion in the agenda. They nodded and followed her lead, clearly worried about jeopardizing the contract. She received emails from Black employees within the airline, thanking her indirectly. They had heard rumors that someone important had taken a stand, prompting a significant shakeup in the hierarchy. Some saw it as a glimmer of hope in a corporate world that too often looked the other way. Months passed, and the traveler observed incremental changes. The airline's customer satisfaction surveys reported fewer discrimination complaints. The older flight attendant was officially dismissed after numerous passengers came forward sharing similar experiences. New staff were trained more rigorously, and the traveler started to notice small improvements on her flights. She never forgot that morning, though, the feeling of eyes on her as if she didn't belong. Word about the incident trickled out to broader circles, though the airline tried to keep it discreet. People speculated that the company was desperate to maintain a major contract, which had forced them to confront their internal issues. The traveler remained quietly in the background, letting her influence speak for itself. She had no desire for public accolades. She cared only about real change. She understood that corporate promises could fade if pressure eased. One day, she received a personal invitation to a gathering hosted by the airline's top brass, celebrating the initial success of the partnership. She debated whether to attend, wary of turning into a token figure for them to parade, but she decided to go, reminding herself that presence can be power. She arrived in the same burgundy pantsuit she had worn that fateful day, head held high. She was greeted warmly by a newly hired employee tasked with welcoming guests. She noticed a genuine friendliness, a far cry from the hostility she had faced before. Inside the event space, executive after executive approached her, offering thanks. She met some of their new diversity officers who explained the programs they were implementing. She listened carefully, trying to gauge sincerity. They seemed earnest enough, but she still maintained a healthy skepticism. Throughout the evening, she felt eyes on her again, but this time with curiosity and respect rather than derision. She could sense the undercurrent of conversation. That's the woman who almost pulled the contract. That's the woman who demanded accountability. For a moment, a twinge of discomfort surfaced. She never asked for this spotlight, but she accepted that it might help keep the company on the path of reform. She politely navigated small talk and politely excused herself when executives tried to praise her for bringing them to the next level. She knew the real praise belonged to those everyday passengers who fought prejudice without any corporate power at their backs. Later, she caught sight of the black woman she had defended on the plane. She was standing with a small group, laughing. The traveler went over and greeted her. The woman's eyes lit up with recognition, and she introduced the traveler to others, calling her the quiet hero of that flight. They shared a warm hug. The traveler felt a rush of gratitude that the woman was here, smiling and feeling included, even in a space that once might have rejected her. They exchanged stories discussing how the airline had followed up with personal apologies and offered compensation. While that didn't erase the harm, it was a step. Before leaving, the traveler stepped outside onto a balcony overlooking the city's lights. She breathed the night air, reflecting on the journey. She recalled the hush of the airplane cabin, the flight attendant's sharp tone, and how swiftly those 6 minutes of tension after landing had escalated into a decision that changed everything. She thought of her younger self, struggling to break glass ceilings, fighting just to be heard. Now she was shaping corporate behaviors and setting higher standards for respect and equality. It was a heavy burden, but one she shouldered with pride. She checked her watch, realizing she had stayed longer than intended. As she walked back through the event space, a few people thanked her again, smiling as they passed. She gave them polite nods, her mind already drifting to the next challenge. Life would continue, and new forms of discrimination would emerge. But for this one airline, for these passengers, for these employees, she had caused a seismic shift. The memory of that flight would remain a stark reminder that silence perpetuates injustice, and that power, when used responsibly, can create waves of change that echo far beyond the moment. Her car pulled up to the curb, and she settled into the back seat. Leaning her head against the window, she glanced at the starless sky, letting the city lights flood her vision. She scrolled through messages from friends and colleagues, many congratulating her on the success of the partnership. A part of her realized that the real success was that marginalized voices might now be heard more frequently within that airline's corridors. As the car wove through the streets toward her hotel, she thought about the future. She recognized that prejudice doesn't vanish overnight. Still, she found solace in the fact that in those 6 pivotal minutes after landing, she had chosen action over complicity, transforming her frustration into leverage. She no longer had to accept microaggressions and bias as an inevitable part of her travel experience. She could push back. And if she could push back, maybe others would too. In the weeks that followed, she spoke at a quiet gathering of colleagues, sharing her story in a measured, professional tone. She didn't name the airline directly. She emphasized the importance of confronting bias, not just with words, but with real consequences. She urged them to remember that every decision, every contract, has the power to alter the corporate landscape. Some listened intently, others with skepticism. But she knew at least a few hearts were moved, a few minds awakened. She hoped they would carry the lesson forward. That sense of purpose guided her next steps. She met with civil rights organizations, discussing ways to create more accountability in the airline industry. She connected with grassroots groups that collected passenger testimonies of discrimination. She leveraged her influence to encourage other companies to adopt similar ethical clauses in their contracts. Her phone rang often with requests for her to help shape corporate responsibility policies. She tried to answer each call with integrity and humility, remembering the woman on the plane who had been singled out over an extra fee she did not owe. She sometimes wondered what became of the older flight attendant, though not with sympathy. She imagined her stepping back to reflect on the consequences of her hostility. Maybe she realized that her prejudice had cost the airline dearly, or maybe she carried on with resentment, blaming everyone but herself. The traveler hoped that, at the very least, it served as a cautionary tale for others who thought they could mistreat passengers without repercussions. Over time, the traveler gradually shifted her focus to other projects. The contract with the airline seemed secure, and their actions, while not perfect, indicated progress. She still flew for business, occasionally choosing other carriers out of preference and curiosity about their service. Each time, she carried the memory of that day like a compass, reminding her that she had the authority to demand better treatment. Sometimes, on flights with the same airline, she sensed a more respectful atmosphere, more vigilant attendants, and a more inclusive approach. It felt like a small victory in a vast battlefield. The story of that flight spread quietly. People in her industry referred to it in hushed tones, calling it the contract crisis. Some admired her resolve, while others felt she overstepped. She cared little for the politics. She knew that as a black woman her actions spoke volumes, challenging the status quo that so often silenced voices like hers. She had stepped forward when it mattered most, forcing an entire company to confront its flaws. On a crisp autumn morning, she received a letter from a staff member at the airline's corporate office. Enclosed were photos of new training sessions, new materials that emphasized cultural sensitivity and passenger rights. The staff member wrote that morale was improving, and more employees felt empowered to call out discrimination when they saw it. The traveler smiled softly, recognizing that although not every corner of the industry had changed, at least one pocket was brighter. Throughout her journey, she remained poised, aware that not every confrontation would end in triumph. She knew that for every success there could be setbacks, but she carried with her the knowledge that real power came not just from her corporate position, but from her unwavering sense of self-worth and her commitment to justice. The simple truth was that she refused to be treated as less than she was, and she refused to allow others to be treated that way when she had a chance to intervene. Whenever she felt weary, she remembered the looks on the faces of those passengers who had endured that flight attendant's harsh scrutiny. She remembered the warmth in the eyes of the black woman who had embraced her at the event. She remembered the courageous people who shared their stories after hearing hers. Each memory reinforced her belief that her actions had sparked something that could continue to grow, long after she moved on to the next contract, the next negotiation, the next flight. And so she carried on, a quiet force in the corporate world, deftly tying moral principle to financial consequence in a way that couldn't be ignored. She made sure that airlines and other companies recognized the stakes of ignoring discrimination. She knew that her position was unique, and she chose not to squander it by simply conforming. Because of that choice, an airline that once allowed blatant prejudice to fester was forced to reckon with its failures. Countless passengers she would never meet now traveled with a slightly better chance of receiving the respect they deserved. Looking back, she traced it all to a singular decision in those crucial minutes after she landed. She could have walked away, shaken her head, and gone about her day. But she refused to let it slide. By leveraging her influence, she broke the silence that often surrounds racial harassment in everyday situations. In so doing, she changed the trajectory of an entire corporate giant, proving that sometimes one voice, backed by power and principle, can echo loud enough to bring about reform. She understood that there was more work ahead, that prejudice finds new forms even when old ones are dismantled. Yet, each step forward made a difference. She continued flying, continued advocating, continued to encourage others to stand their ground. And somewhere out there, she imagined, a new generation of professionals, black, brown, marginalized, would read about the day a black woman canceled a big airline contract because a flight attendant dared to harass her. They would learn that it only took 6 minutes of fortitude to protect their dignity and reshape a corporate culture. They would learn to claim their rightful place in the sky, no matter who tried to deny it. Did you enjoy this story of ambition, courage, and the power of one voice to spark change? Let us know in the comments. What part resonated with you the most, or which character's journey surprised you? We love hearing your thoughts, and if you want more stories like this, full of twists, heart, and inspiration, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. There's plenty more where this came from, and we'd love for you to be part of this journey.